Yeah, I know. Let me elaborate. So this isn't exactly a groundbreaking discussion. In fact, it's one that's surfaced quite a bit throughout the past generation. But particularly with the advent of the Nintendo Switch, the quoted true portable handheld has kind of withered away. What do I mean by a true handheld? Well, historically speaking, in that prior to 2017, there were a few specific unique attributes that would make a handheld stand out as a separate type of gaming device. First and foremost, you obviously had the portability. Now, the phrase portable is pretty broad. You could buy something as large as a portable house, or even go to the park and use a porta potty. But I think as far as gaming is concerned, the idea of what is or isn't portable has kind of been challenged throughout the years. You could look at something like the Game Boy that could last more than 30 hours on 4 AA batteries, or you can look at something like the Sega Game Gear that runs 3 to 5 hours on 6 AA batteries, and they would both technically be considered portable. There were a few game consoles around the turn of the millennium that would come with an LCD screen, but you had to plug that into place, so was that considered portable? And then you have something as silly as the Virtual Boy, which people seem to also argue is portable. The point is, it is a very broad discussion. Now, personally, if you ask me, I would say there are key features that would make a handheld console portable. And I think these are the most important features. The first one, and potentially the most important one, is the size. I think for a console to be a truly portable console, the most important attribute it must have is its size. In my opinion, if you have to think about how you're going to transport your console from one place to another, it is no longer portable. If you consider how big some of the larger phones are, and yet they're still able to fit into most people's pockets, I think that's about the size a console should get to. Most of these modern handheld consoles, they don't really make that cutoff. Like, sure, if you're somebody that's got to carry a school bag or a laptop bag and you're just adding an extra object to carry around with you, then maybe you got an argument there. But again, I would compare it to a cell phone. A cell phone fits in your pocket. You don't need to carry a bag with you. You don't got to think about what you're going to be taking with you in order to bring it along. I don't know if there's really a true portable handheld market at this point. Maybe some of the emulating devices, but I think the last actual handheld portable devices that competed from the big companies were the PlayStation Vita and the 3DS. Now, I don't have a PS Vita, but I do have a 3DS XL, and I know it fits in my pocket and I can take it out with me wherever I go. And again, that's the new 3DS XL, which I believe is the largest of the 3DS family. But the Switch, and arguably the Switch Lite, don't quite make that cutoff. The PlayStation Vita was already pushing how long a portable console should be, and the Lite just takes a little bit longer than that. Obviously, with the Switch 2 being larger, as well as the Steam Decks, the PlayStation Portal, and even whatever contraption you have to use to connect to your phone in order to play xCloud. These things are all usually going to be too big to carry around with you. Now granted, with the PlayStation Portal you'll be streaming at home, so that doesn't really matter, but still, you get my point when it comes to the size. Now, circling back to the Switch 2, since that's the motivation for this video, I don't think it's small enough to be considered a portable handheld device at all. And to take it a step further, when they inevitably make a Switch Lite 2, or are they going to call it a Switch 2 Lite? Well, whenever they make that thing, it's not going to be portable. In fact, I'm guessing it's going to be as large as the original Switch 1, not even the Lite. Because how else are they going to justify the $350 price tag, and they have to give corporate fanboys a chance to argue that the extra 10% in cost is worth the 45% price increase? So yeah, Switch 2 Lite will definitely be larger than the Switch Lite at least. Now, as far as the size is concerned, there's also the durability you gotta think about. Once again, using the Switch Lite as a comparison, because I'm not really sure how the PlayStation Portal feels, but I know that when I'm traveling with a Switch or with a Switch Lite and I'm throwing it into a bag, I'm very cautious about what's around the Switch. I'd be worried about the joysticks. If I was to throw a Switch Lite into my pocket, I'd be worried about the impact of the buttons and the joystick with the inside of my pocket. If I was to take it with me, I'd have to be concerned about where I'd put it on a table, I'd be concerned about potentially dropping it. Basically, a lot of the same stuff that would be on your mind when you have a phone that you don't think about as much because the phone is more durable. Or at least the form factor of the phone is more durable, whether it's face down or face up. And I mean, most of us have cases on it too, so if we drop it, we're not as concerned. But the buttons and the joystick on these portable devices can leave you a bit worried. And really, it's more so the joystick than the buttons. This is why the clamshells were genius for the foldable ones. starting way back with the Game Boy Advance SP and continuing along with the DS and 3DS families. The outer cases of these consoles would take the beating so that the inside could remain intact, whether it's the really fine scratches on the screen or your buttons potentially facing damage. Now granted, prior to the Game Boy Advance SP, having the OG Game Boy in your pocket was a tough fit, but it could still fit. The thing is, back then I'm pretty sure pockets were just tighter, or maybe it was just that we were kids so it felt like we had smaller pockets. It was the thickness of the Game Boy that caused most of the issues, and the fact that we were all wearing jeans. But you could get by with it pretty easily in your jacket pocket at least, especially in comparison to the Game Gear, because you weren't taking that thing with you unless you were bringing a power adapter and a carrying case regardless. But that's why Nintendo eventually released the Game Boy Pocket, because they felt like it should fit in your pocket, which I think is just about as straightforward as the title of a console could get. And if you think that's creative, wait till you find out what they called the first colored Game Boy, or the first Nintendo with dual screens. Yeah, if those guys were still naming the consoles, there's a good chance it would be called the Nintendo Hybrid. Anyway, it's the same idea with the Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color. They're able to put them in your jean pocket. They're a lot smaller now. They're the size of a phone today, for example, maybe even smaller. Perhaps just as thick if you have a case on your phone. Same idea. Portable, durable-ish, and pocketable. But then you throw it next to a Game Boy Advance SP, and all of a sudden it is more durable and more pocketable. And they added more technology to it. You now have a backlit light. You could stop washing out all the colors in your game so that people can see them properly. They found a way to take a horizontally oriented device with buttons on its side and improve on its form factor in multiple ways to make it more portable and more durable. And then it just kind of evolved from there with the DS. And then they just made a bunch of different types of DSs, and each one of them was more portable than the last. Even when they got bigger, they often got thinner. You had some XL models that would push the limit, but for the most part they stayed in their lanes. But in addition to the size and the durability, the next key factor, and this one might actually be the most important depending on the type of gamer you are, is the battery life. I already mentioned the difference in the battery life between the Sega Game Gear as well as the Game Boy, and I can completely respect that the Game Gear had a backlit light as well as a colored screen. But I think in typical Sega fashion, they kind of went too big too fast. The market wasn't quite there yet. And in addition to the fact that this giant console could not fit into your pocket, it would also drain its battery way too quick, which made it problematic. Now, I remember having a Game Gear at one point, but I think it was my friend's that I borrowed for a year or two. During that time, I'm pretty sure he had my Game Boy. But the point is, along with that Game Gear, we never once put a single battery in there. We had plugs for it. One was for the car and one was for the house. These were not chargers, these were just straight up power plugs. And in the car, it went into the cigarette lighter. Do they still make cigarette lighters in cars? Seriously, I haven't actually thought about this in a very long time. None of the cars that I've driven in the past decade probably had cigarette lighters. That's insane. I've never even seen anybody light a cigarette with it, but I definitely burned my finger a ton of times on it. But anyway, for you youngins, car chargers were this weird dongle that you stuck into a hole. Yeah, that's about as best as I can explain it. So I remember I used to like using the Game Gear a lot for our long road trips, because not only would the car keep it powered, but I'd be able to see the screen even if it got dark outside, and I wouldn't have to wait for the street lights to figure out what I'm doing. Yeah, Pokemon Blue Rock Cave got through it with the street lights. That's the Nintendo magic that I've been crying about for a month. Now, in fairness, there were accessories you could purchase for the Game Boy to make it about as useful as a Game Gear was in the vehicle, minus the colored screen. But by the time you finished throwing all that stuff on your Game Boy, you might as well have just stayed home. Either way, as long as you weren't fighting with the light, the long hours of availability on the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance made it so that it was a console that you can take with you and play for about as long as you need to. The timings usually vary depending on how intense it was, but usually it's enough. And that somewhat continued with the Nintendo DS. It might have been a little bit closer to not making it as long as you'd like unless you put it on the lowest brightness setting. And of course, this also varies depending on which type of DS you had. But I think it fits the modern day rule of if you were to leave the house with it on full charge and played sporadically throughout the day, it wouldn't die out. I would say when it got to the 3DS, that's about when you kind of hit the limit, where if you go any lower than this, you'd really be pushing that limit. Actually, come to think of it, I don't think the 3DS makes the cut. I mean, it does for me because I'm usually playing retro games on my DS, so I'm able to get up to 10 hours that way. But let's say you wanted to sit down and play a 3DS title, you're looking at maximum maybe 6 hours. It probably has just enough charge for a 4 or 5 hour long road trip, Or it could also work out if you're somebody that takes the train and need to play for an hour each way for the commute, and maybe you want to play an hour during your lunch break. But at that point, you're looking at Switch numbers as far as battery life is concerned. I still have a launch day Switch. I'm pretty sure on the lowest setting, if I stretch it as far as possible, playing a very light indie game, I might be able to get 7 hours-ish. But I think most times I'd be lucky to get 3 or 4 hours. Now, when they revamped it, that added 2 or 3 hours to the mix, and the Switch Lite and the Switch OLED are comparable to that. But yeah, comfortably speaking, when you're looking at 3DS and Switch, that battery life really comes into question. But I think the 3DS does have the size and the durability over the Switch. And I mean, of course, we're not comparing the games here. The 3DS is like a GameCube, and the Switch is like, well, if you ask anti-Nintendo people, they'll say it's like an Xbox 360. But really my point here is that I understand why the Switch and the 3DS have a weaker battery life than the consoles that came before it, especially when you consider the Game Boy original just basically had a calculator screen, and that's why it was able to last so long. But regardless of why, that battery life is very important. Now, mind you, the reason I didn't even bring up the PSP into the battery life discussion is because I believe both the original PSP and the PS Vita capped off at like 5 hours, maybe 6. So they were more similar to the Sega Game Gear in that they were not really portable if you were looking for a long battery life. Now, the best part is that the Switch 2 has an even shorter battery life than the original Switch, with Eurogamer stating that it might have approximately 2 to 6.5 hours, which, if I am not mistaken, is roughly in line with the Steam Deck battery life. So, given the way that the Switch was, the way that the Switch 2 is going to be, the way that all of the Steam Decks look, it's pretty clear to me that they are more focused on the high-quality games, and not so much the actual handheld nature of the device. Which is not really a complaint, it's more of an observation. I effectively got to play through Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild sitting in a work truck on a construction site, so I can appreciate the power of these consoles. But I also realize they aren't exactly portable. They are not durable to travel with, and they have a pretty terrible battery life. And the Switch 2 is going to be worse on all of those fronts. Now, Nintendo clearly does not care about this. And again, this is not a criticism, it's an observation. And for me, the proof that they didn't care about this is because of how they made the Switch 2. Basically the exact same way as the original Switch, but bigger. In some of my previous videos, I mentioned a lack of innovation going into the next Switch. And a lot of you called me out as being some kind of dumb Nintendo fan that wanted waggle controls or, I don't know, some kind of dumb gimmick. Meanwhile, those same people were telling me how the mouse control was the most innovative thing on the planet, so the mouse controls are a dumb gimmick. But whatever, that's besides the point. When I said I would like them to expand on the Switch and innovation, it didn't necessarily mean in the games. I just wanted to see what the improvement was going to be, more than just charging 1 sec, let me do the math real quick. 2.5 cents for every additional 1,000 pixels, if my math was correct. So the kind of innovation that I might have liked to see, maybe give it some kind of clamshell device, a foldable protective cover, a foldable screen, maybe find a way to make the battery life last 2 or 3 times as long. I mean, those 2 things alone would have been innovative marvels. You could have kept a screener on the size of an OLED, made it foldable so that it fits into your pocket better, and I don't know, find a way to make the Joy-Cons fold into each other and be like, hey look, this portable device now fits into your pocket. But again, I don't think they really cared too much about this aspect of it for the innovation. They cared more about the extra pixels. But these are the kind of things that could have been implemented where I would look and be like, oh, that's neat. A foldable phone costs around $1,500, and that's a very nice way to make a larger screen fit into your pocket. All of a sudden, I'm thinking less about the price tag itself and more about what it's bringing to the table. And again, I realize 2 cents per 1,000 pixels is a great deal for some of you, but not for everybody. That being said, there is a whole other layer to this. Now, handheld consoles used to have unique features that I guess don't really need to exist anymore because there's no need for them for one reason or another. Nobody really needs PictoChat if you have a cell phone. Having some kind of social community along your console is not really that big of a deal anymore. I mean, even back then, the DS having a clock and a calculator was a big deal. But there were usually some neat things you can do with your handhelds that aren't quite as interesting. Link cables, DS download play, those kind of stuff for multiplayer was a lot of fun. But now, I mean, you got a hotspot, you're good to go. But the other thing is the devices themselves had an identity. Like a physical identity. The Game Boy looked like a thick gray brick with purple buttons. The Game Boy Advance had that atomic purple color that matched the atomic purple Nintendo 64 controller, as well as the GameCube, which was purple. You had the fat DS with the shoulder muscles, the slick and smoothness of the DS Lite. There was a lot of character in those devices themselves, and it made them stand out. And they usually matched their console counterparts. Like I said, the Game Boy Advance was purple. I put my launch black DS next to my launch black Wii U, and they looked the same. The DS and the Wii U were kind of on the more boring end, but that's besides the point. Although in fairness, that's because I got the black 3DS, you could get plenty of different colors and that would make them a lot more unique. So the Switch kind of continued this a little bit with the Joy-Cons. But they did give you options. You could go with the regular, dull, gray colored Joy-Cons, or you can go with the colored ones. And then they released about 6 billion different colors too, so that you can buy more if you wanted. Now the Joy-Cons themselves, I would argue, were the biggest indication of character in the Nintendo Switch. I mean, seriously, take the Joy-Cons off of your Switch, and it's just basically your phone but a little bit bigger. It is the most homogenized looking tablet you've ever seen in your life. Well, most homogenized looking tablet with rails at the ends of it. But yeah, even the dock was just the boring same color. Now you can customize it if you like, but you can customize anything. In fairness, Nintendo did give people a few options, mostly in the form of limited edition consoles, and that would allow you to kind of accessorize your Switch a little bit better. For example, I have two docks. One of them is the Animal Crossing one, and the other one is the red one that came with the Mario Bros. Switch. But in both cases, I had to jump through different loops in order to get myself those docks used and then sell mine so that I can upgrade them without changing my Switch, because I didn't need a new Switch. I just wanted my docks to look different. But it would have been cool if Nintendo was just like, here's a list of 15 different colored docks that match our Joy-Cons, for example, and just go to the store and buy one. But the docks are not part of the handheld discussion. I don't know why I'm going on about that. But my point is that the Switch did the bare minimum to remain a unique handheld console, except when they released the Switch Lite. And credit to Nintendo, I think the Switch Lite has way more character than the original Switch. And since it is a handheld console, I think Nintendo understood that. They wanted to make it stand out the way other handhelds stand out. So at the very least, I gotta give them credit where it's due in that regard. But the Switch 2, until we get the Switch 2 Lite or the Switch Lite 2, took away the one thing that made the Switch look kind of unique, and that is the color of the Joy-Cons, at least for now. When the Joy-Cons are plugged in, you can't even really tell they're a different color. It's basically just the gray Joy-Cons at this point. And I realize they're going to be selling at least a dozen different Joy-Con colors because that's what they did with the first one. But when they launched the Switch with the colored Joy-Cons in addition to the gray ones, they gave the Switch a lot of character. So it's a bit unfortunate that they don't have a launch model of the Switch 2 to provide that same amount of character. I mean, even the OLED really stuck out with that commanding white color on the Joy-Cons. But with that aside, because again, I think they're going to be fixing that minor criticism about the lack of uniqueness in the Switch with future colors. The other issue of why I feel there is no truly unique handheld console anymore is because there aren't really any more handheld games. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are handheld games, but they're made up of one of two categories. Either they are mobile games, which you would normally play on your phone, and with the amount of crapware available on your mobile phones, it might not even be worth figuring out which games on there are actually good to play. Or the alternative to that, and the better option, are indie games. These are your smaller scale games. Generally speaking, from the 3DS and all the consoles before it, there was a handheld market of games. Throughout the past few decades, it was a lot of the 2D games. When the consoles made the jump to the 3D world, a lot of 2D games got relegated to a handheld device. I'm talking your Marios, your top-down Zeldas, your Metroids, the whole works. But even when they went to 3D, they were a lot more simplified. Naturally, that's because the actual technology was limited. But these games were often simpler, smaller, more affordable, and could be played in shorter bursts so that you could finish something and not feel obligated to continue to get to a good stopping point. That last point is critical because modern consoles have a lot of these quick resume features, which takes care of most of that issue, but the problem is the devs aren't exactly designing around these stopping points anymore. So now, even if I could theoretically just close my Switch, turn it back on later, and be in the exact same spot I was before, I gotta lick my finger and put it in the air and see which way the wind is blowing to get a feel for which way I was going, especially in some of these more intense titles. because effectively I'm playing games that are not meant for handheld as a handheld title. So that comes with a few drawbacks. I don't know if this happens to anybody else, but there are games where I come back to after not playing them for a few weeks, maybe a month or two, and I just have no idea what was going on, and sometimes I am so lost that I just decide to start the game over. With traditional handheld titles, that wasn't as common. It still happened. I mean, RPGs exist, so if you're putting that down, you might get confused. But for the most part, the games were designed in a way where when you'd pick it up, you'd be able to click on something, finish that, and then close it up again. That's a little bit more difficult when you're playing a game that's meant for the big screen. But even beyond that, you very rarely get those low-budget first-party titles anymore. The low-budget Switch titles kind of remind me of the Vita or the PSP. I've played a few of the games on there, primarily the God of War ones, and while they feel like proper video games, they feel a lot more watered down than the actual console version of those titles. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that. I've heard similar arguments for the Grand Theft Auto portable games, for example. So basically, rather than taking something that feels like it has a low floor and building a grandiose adventure out of it, it feels like they're taking something with a high ceiling and watering it down to the middle. To kind of elaborate on that, we'll go back to the Game Gear and the Game Boy. I made a retrospective video last year where I covered both Mega Man Game Gear and Mega Man 4 for the Game Boy. Both of these titles had a lot of inspiration from Mega Man 4 and 5 from the NES, but they both approached their titles in a different way. The Game Gear, having the colored screen, took that full NES console title, zoomed in a bunch to create some screen crunch, removed a bunch of collectibles and features from the NES counterparts, and gave you roughly a 45-minute adventure and called it Mega Man Game Gear. In effect, it was a very watered-down console title so you can play it on handheld. The Game Boy version, on the other hand, went for the different approach. They don't have the colored screen and they're a weaker console. So instead, they took inspiration from the NES level themes and enemies, and created a full-on 2-ish hour adventure to play on your Game Boy, built from the ground up. I think they even added cutscenes and a story which the NES games didn't get. It is almost unanimously agreed upon in the Mega Man community that Mega Man 4 is one of the best handheld Mega Man games. And likewise, it is pretty much agreed upon in the entire Mega Man community that Mega Man Game Gear is the worst game of them all. That's kind of what I feel like we currently get on the Switch. Again, outside of the budget titles. For example, you had a game like Golf Story, which came out in the first year of the Switch's life, which I thought was phenomenal. It was roughly a 15-hour adventure. It cost $15, but I think I got it on a deal too, so it was cheaper than that. It was a proper handheld indie title, and I remember thinking to myself, this could work if Nintendo was to make games of this style onto this console, maybe even up it to like the DS levels or the 3DS levels, this could work. And games like that were made. Metroid Dread was made. Octopath Traveler was made. Link's Awakening was made. These are games that would have traditionally ended up on the handheld console that Nintendo had in addition to its home console. But keep in mind, the 3DS games capped off at $40. And if I'm not mistaken, the DS and the Game Boy Advance games capped off at $35. Basically, handheld titles were supposed to be 25% cheaper. Now, again, you could argue that Metroid Dread is a 2D game that shouldn't be a handheld title, and Links Between Worlds for you is worth $60, and Octopath Traveler is amazing and gorgeous and it's worth $60. And I wouldn't even give you pushback for that. I can somewhat agree. I've always said that the value of $1 for me is not the same as a value of $1 for you, and what makes a game worth the price for me is not the same of what will make a game worth the price for you. I thought, and still do, think that Mario 3D All-Stars is a steal, and many others don't. So it's just the reality of how we each quantify the value of our gaming experience. But the point still stands that the high-quality games that would have ended up on a handheld console for the handheld price are not exactly existent. Instead, we got the ports for $40. We got the party games for $40. We got the watered-down third-party titles for $40. And don't get me wrong, many of those $40 games are worth it. But again, they don't feel like games that were built for the ground up for being that budget experience, similar to previous handhelds. Rather, they feel like high-end titles with baggage. And that baggage, whether it's because it's a port or whether it's a party game that won't last as long or isn't as popular, whatever the reason is, that baggage brings it down in price. So in effect, when I used to go to the store and buy a 3DS title and feel like I am getting the best kind of game that I could get on this device, now when I'm going to buy a game at that same price, I can't help but wonder what is wrong with this game that it's priced lower. Oh, look at that. I just explained the problem with variable pricing without even trying. So yeah, to kind of wrap things up, basically all of this stuff put together for me means that we are far removed from a true handheld experience. Far removed from what made handheld gaming devices handheld over the past 30 years. Now, they don't really exist. But I also don't know if people want them to exist. I've mentioned cell phones a few times already. That probably has taken up that entire market. And I clearly feel a lot more passionate about this than many others do because seemingly not many people care that those handheld devices are not around anymore. And even as I say that, I don't even know how much I care. I still think that the Switch 1 was one of my favorite consoles of all time. So it's not like I'm sitting here going, oh yeah, they were wrong for removing the handheld markets from the street. But yeah, it still kind of sucks that they don't exist anymore. Or, I mean, they do exist, you just gotta buy an old one. I have a 3DS completely decked out, fits into my pocket, I can take it anywhere I go, and with the types of games that I play on there, the battery life lasts longer than I need it to last. It is by and large my preferred handheld gaming device, more so than the Nintendo Switch and more so than any other console that I might buy in the future. But that being said, it would be cool if part of this whole Switch 2 evolution where they're now trying to compete with the big boys, and it seems like they're potentially trying to knock Sony off of the perch that they're sitting on, or at least potentially closing that gap a lot more. If all of this leads to Nintendo bringing out a line of, I don't know, 4DS, and they use that to cover the budget handheld experience, that would be pretty cool. I don't think this will happen for the record, but it would be pretty cool. Either way, I just kind of wanted to share my thoughts about the way we've moved away from true handheld gaming in the past few decades, and how a combination of the hybrid console as well as mobile gaming has probably destroyed a historically very popular market that just quite frankly no longer exists. Because in my opinion, the entire Nintendo Switch family, including the Switch 2, including the Switch Lite, is not handheld enough. Thanks again for listening, and I will catch you guys on the next one.